Thank you for joining me for session 6. Our chair is this morning's speaker, Tom Petit from Somerville High School. Tom, I'm handing it over to you.
Great. So yeah, I'm excited to introduce the next speakers for a session on equity in high school physics classroom. The first speaker is Marta Stokel. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. And the title of the presentation is Gender Self-Assessment in Classroom Experience.
Hi, I'm Marta Stokel. I am a science teacher at Tartan High School, and I'm a PhD student in STEM education at the University of Minnesota. And I'm going to talk about my work on gender, self-efficacy, and classroom experiences. So I'm using this framework of physics identity, where physics identity describes being seen as seeing yourself as the kind of person who does physics. And Carlone and Johnson propose a framework for physics identity with 3 dimensions: competence, which is skill and ability with physics; performance, which is acting, speaking, and dressing in ways associated with physics; and recognition, which I'll talk more about shortly. So why does physics identity matter? It's been shown to be a predictor of students' intention to persist in the field. So students with a strong physics identity are more likely to major in and pursue careers in fields closely related to physics. In addition, women, especially women of color, are less likely than their male peers to report holding a physics identity, even among students who are already majoring in physics or a closely related field. This suggests that understanding the development of a physics identity can be one way to understand issues of underrepresentation in physics. I've decided to focus on the recognition dimension of physics identity. And this is being seen as a physics person. And it's both external, where teachers and peers and other people around a student see them as a physics person, and it's internal. Internal includes things like confidence and self-efficacy. Bandura defined self-efficacy as your belief in your capacity to succeed, whereas confidence is the student's perceptions of their achievement. And confidence is frequently a precursor of self-efficacy. And so these 2 ideas are very, very closely related. There's been a lot of work looking at gender differences in self-efficacy among college students. Several studies have found that among introductory college students, men tend to have more self-efficacy than women, even when they have similar levels of achievement. In addition, a few studies have found that students' self-efficacy tends to decline during an intro college physics course, and that women's self-efficacy declines more than men's, which suggests that there's something going on in the classroom that impacts students' beliefs about whether or not they can succeed in physics. So that leads to my first question. Since most of the literature focuses on college classrooms, I wanted to take a look at my high school classroom and see, is there a confidence gap between boys and girls in my own classroom? So my context is an AP Physics 1 class at a suburban public high school. The majority of my students are 12th grade, and the course is entirely elective. The curriculum is based on modeling instruction, and I use standards-based grading. So students take a quiz roughly once per week, where they get a score for each learning target that appears on the assessment. In addition, much like schools nationwide, AP Physics at my school does not match the school overall. Only 36% of AP Physics students are girls, and only 31% are students of color, when 56% of the school overall is students of color. I should note, there's very, very few girls of color in AP Physics 1 at my school, which rules out doing any kind of intersectional analysis, even though there's some very good evidence that women of color face some unique and specific issues in physics classrooms. So the way I decided to measure confidence, and I focused on confidence instead of self-efficacy because it's much easier to measure directly, I had students at the end of each quiz do a self-assessment where they rated what score they think they got on each learning target. And then over the course of 2 years, I recorded students' actual scores and their self-assessments. I then used those to get an average self-assessment and an average actual score over the course of the year for each student, and I plotted those onto something called a CCL confidence achievement window. This is a graph for relating confidence and achievement. So most of my students fell into the upper right quadrant, which represents high confidence and high achievement, or the lower left quadrant, which represents low confidence and low achievement. So the majority of my students seem to have a pretty well-calibrated confidence, where their perceptions are very in line with their actual achievement. Now, if boys had higher confidence in my class, I would expect a large portion of them to fall into that lower right quadrant with high confidence and low achievement. And then I would expect girls to be overrepresented in the upper left quadrant with low confidence and high achievement. But when I look at the actual proportion of each population that fits those two quadrants, it's a pretty similar distribution between boys and girls, which suggests there is not much of a confidence gap in my classroom. So that leads to my next research questions. First, what kinds of classroom experiences are influencing that student's self-efficacy? Since there's evidence that self-efficacy changes during an introductory physics course, and there doesn't seem to be much of a gap in my classroom, what's going on to cause that? And then the other question I had at this point is, are there gender differences in the kinds of classroom experiences that students see as influencing their self-efficacy? To approach these questions, I took a qualitative approach. I conducted some student interviews at the end of the school year. These were structured interviews, so I had my questions planned out ahead of time. I ended up interviewing 10 students, 4 girls and 6 boys, which was fairly representative of the course demographics. All of the students were volunteers. They are students that I think had an overall pretty positive experience in the course, which does put a limitation on my results. I analyzed these results using emergent thematic analysis. So I went through the transcripts and the audio recordings of the interview to look for what are ideas that showed up multiple times in interviews. The first theme I noticed with that approach is external recognition from peers. And boys and girls that I interviewed talked about this very, very differently. The boy I have quoted here gave a pretty representative response. The boys tended to think their peers believed they were pretty good at physics, and they talked about experiences like their peers asking for their ideas, listening to what they had to say. A few boys talked about classmates seeking them out for questions. And so these boys very consistently had these experiences where peers took concrete actions that communicated to the boys that they believed they were good at physics. Now, only one of the girls that I interviewed talked about any kind of experience like this. And she interpreted that very, very differently than the boys. So even though she talked about some similar experiences with classmates seeking her input, she saw them as connecting that to her being a smart person in general and overestimating her abilities in physics. And so she did not see her academic abilities translating into the physics classroom. Now, to put on my teacher hat instead of my researcher hat for a moment, for me, this has some implications for my teaching. One of the questions I want to think about going forward is, how can I better structure my classroom so that all students see their strengths as valuable to the group? The girl that I quoted on the previous slide is someone that I saw as bringing some very valuable contributions to the class. And so what can I do differently to make sure she recognizes the value of those contributions? I also am thinking about, how can I ensure that every student gets positive recognition from peers? It's possible that one of the reasons girls didn't tend to talk about that external recognition from peers is they may not have had as many of those experiences. And if that's the case, what can I do differently to make sure girls are getting those experiences just as often as the boys? The next big theme I saw was external recognition from the teacher, myself, typically in the form of feedback I put on graded quizzes. While both boys and girls talked about this, they talked about it very, very differently. The boy I have quoted here is fairly representative. He said, if I have a good grade and the teacher's the one who graded it, that must mean the teacher believes I'm good at physics. And so the boys that I interviewed were linking this external recognition with a demonstration of competence. Because they showed that they were good at physics, they believed I must be recognizing that they're good at physics. Now, girls also talked about feedback, but they talked about it very differently. They tended to cite quizzes where they had done poorly as evidence that I believed they're good at physics. They talked about this very growth-oriented perspective on the feedback. Things like constructive criticism, feedback that helped them understand what they did wrong. They talked about that feedback, especially when paired with a pretty liberal retake policy, as evidence that I believed they could improve, and therefore that I believed they are ultimately good at physics, even if they didn't show it on that particular quiz. And so the girls that I interviewed were separating recognition and competence. They could experience external recognition even when they weren't demonstrating competence. So as a teacher thinking about these implications, students are clearly taking messages in the feedback that I put on their quizzes. Even though I try to keep my feedback strictly to what I see on the paper, they are reading into what I put there and taking information about who I think is good at physics and what it means to be good at physics. The perspective that the girls I interviewed had was also incredibly powerful. As a teacher, I want students to believe that they can improve and to see my feedback as evidence of that belief. And so I'm thinking about how can I help all students approach feedback with that growth mindset I saw from the girls that I interviewed. The third theme that I saw emerging was guided inquiry labs, which play a big role in modeling instruction. Now, there weren't gender differences in the way students talked about this, but there was still some interesting things going on. So first, a lot of students talked about guided inquiry labs very positively. They talked about this experience of figuring things out for themselves and that leading to a belief that they were capable of that, which is pretty much the definition of self-efficacy. Students also talked about this guided inquiry labs as a chance to develop identity, feeling like this scientist that knows everything. There were also some students who saw guided inquiry labs as a barrier to their confidence and their self-efficacy. The students who saw it as a barrier tended to talk a lot like the student quoted here, being a student who does well under instruction, being comfortable with step-by-step directions. And so the confusion and the ambiguity that often come with guided inquiry were extremely uncomfortable. There also were a few students who used language like this one who said, when I'm left to do a lab by myself. So they saw me as the teacher as abdicating a pretty standard expected role, and they felt that gap and did not see their peers as filling that gap, leading to this sense of isolation. What was really interesting is that several individual students expressed both of these views during a single interview. And so for a single student, guided inquiry labs could both help them build confidence and therefore self-efficacy, and those same labs could get in the way. So as a teacher, the big implications I see is first that guided inquiry labs are playing an important role in the classroom, not just for students' self-efficacy, but for a more general science identity. But it's important to think about how can I normalize confusion and ambiguity to minimize the negative impacts on students' confidence and self-efficacy. I also want to think about how can I do a better job of structuring group work to ensure that students feel supported even when I'm not playing a role that they expect me to. So my final thoughts, my big takeaways from this work so far. It's clear from the student interviews in particular that external recognition influences self-efficacy and internal recognition in general. And so making sure that every student has experiences where someone else sees them as good at physics and sees the value in their contributions can be a really powerful way to help more students develop a physics identity. It's also clear that what happens in the classroom sends clear messages to students about who is good at physics and what it means to be good at physics. And if I want all of my students to see themselves as potentially good at physics, I need to pay close attention to those messages and be very, very clear that everyone is bringing something of value. So again, my name is Marta Stuckel. Please feel free to contact me to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Martha. That was a wonderful talk. I'm right now trying to see if I can see whose hand is raised, and I'm having a little bit of difficulty with that.
If you want, I can help you with that, Tom, while you figure it out. I see Terry having a hand up and no one else right now. So Terry, why don't you please kick off? And anybody else, raise your hand if you want to get in the queue for asking questions.
Hey there, Marta. Glad I met you earlier today. I was wondering if you felt that there was any difference if you had groups that were all boys or all girls, or if you fiddled with that at all. Because I feel like I have at times have seen that all girl groups working on a lab or all boy groups working on a lab, but there's a distinct difference in how they work. I'm not sure that one of them is better than the other, but there's definitely a difference in the way that they interact.
And there is definitely a lot of literature that backs it up. Gina Weisselman has done some looking at that at the middle school level in physical science classrooms. I haven't had a chance yet to really dig into lab group interactions from a research perspective. What I do as a teacher is I tend to do random groups that typically don't last more than a day or two. And so we're constantly shuffling. Students really like that. They get a chance to build relationships with a lot of different students in the class, but that does then make it hard to do single gender groups. One of the reasons I haven't done a lot of single gender groups in AP Physics is with the way our scheduling works out, I often have one section that's really small. Like this year, my earlier section was 11 kids, whereas my other one was 35. In the section of 11 kids, I only had 3 girls. And so if I did single gender groups, it would just be those 3 girls stuck with each other all the time.
Right.
I did notice that when they had a choice of groups, the girls I tend to see single gender groups form when kids are choosing their own groups. So that's definitely something I want to dig more into.
Thanks.
Great. So Natalie Powers is next.
Hi, Marta. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you've ever had any experience doing any sort of like values assessment or values exercise with your students. I've personally tried it once, and from what I've read in the research, it can do a lot in terms of like stereotype threat and helping students that tend to fall victim to that. And I was just wondering if you've had any experience with it.
Yeah, so this year in the regular physics course, actually based on the Claude Steele book that someone mentioned in the chat as a way to address stereotype threat, so in regular physics, we have students complete some kind of reflection almost once a week. And one of the reflections we started putting into our rotation was for students to identify a strength that's important to them. And then the next question was to talk about why that strength was important to them. And then we had a question about how they used that strength in the physics classroom recently. As a teacher, I really found it fascinating to read those. And it was sometimes kind of fun to see the things that kids started to recognize as a strength that they were bringing into a classroom. Kids would start to recognize that asking questions could be a strength of theirs. One kid asked me, can I put down coming up with crazy ideas for how to do the lab as my strength this week? And that was awesome to see students recognizing some of that, or some of those values that they were bringing to the classroom.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. The next up is Drew Rosen.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. First off, I guess I just wanted to ask if you published any of this already or so far, or is that, I mean, I'm doing my PhD thesis right now, some presentations or things tonight, so.
Not yet. I'm actually working on a paper on this work this summer and hoping to get it off for a journal to review in August or September.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I get that.
Yep.
I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about the idea of linking boys and were linking recognition to competence, and girls were separating them. I don't know if you were willing or able to maybe talk about that a bit more as to sort of where that comes from, and then what sort of practices may be implemented to be able to so that women can link the two.
So there's some literature out there looking at small group work that suggests that boys it was looking at a middle school classroom, and they found that boys tend to use their contributions to their group to essentially show off, as a way to demonstrate competence, as a way to show off, as a way to compete with their peers. And so I wonder if there's something going on where boys are encouraged to really value those kinds of things. And if they're really valuing demonstrating competence and competing with their peers, then I could imagine that translating into how they look at assessment and tending to want to focus on the assessments where they did well. The girls in that study were much more interested in trying to develop an understanding. And I think that perspective of trying to develop an understanding would contribute to taking a more growth-oriented approach to the feedback. Now, how you foster those two different perspectives, I wish I had the answer to that, because I'd certainly love to encourage all of my students to have that latter perspective.
Okay, thank you. I am interested in some of that literature, so I might just reach out to you, message you or something about that. So thanks.
Oh, absolutely. I'd be happy to send you like my references section.
Next up for questions is Miliana.
Okay. Thank you so much for the inspiring talk, first. And second, this is not really a question, it is more of a comment. So apparently there is a line of research in psychology where there is a short intervention just before students take quizzes, tests, any kind of formal assessments, where they do a quick kind of affirmative or kind of confirmation activity I'm good at, whether it's a sport, whether it's kind of doing something with their younger siblings. So they have the opportunity to kind of put in their heads that they're good at something. And they said that those kinds of things actually significantly build self-confidence. And with these activities or small short interventions before the academic assessment, they tend to do better. So I think just the kind of comment, in case that you're interested in doing research maybe in that area, would be really interesting to see whether this would actually help with physics identity, and especially genders like female students and minorities in STEM or these fields that are predominantly mainstream and male dominated. Just a comment. Thank you so much. Inspiring talk.
Thank you. Marie is up next.
Thank you, Martha. It was an inspiring talk. Just a quick thing from a non-teacher teaching perspective. There's a lot of things that you can figure out, but this equity and building equity in my classroom, I'm going to admit I'm lost. This is really the point where I need help. I've seen, for example, that, and I alluded to it yesterday in my talk already, that in the force concept inventory, giving them that quiz or that test, a day later, I had 60 of the kids that dropped out. 60% of them were girls, and they were all coming and saying, "I can't do this. This is too difficult." And the more I'm saying, "But give me a chance to build you up to that point," the more they say, "I cannot risk this because my GPA is going to drop. I cannot risk a B+ in your course because I'm not going to get into university. And that is where I go, I don't know, how do you change that narrative? How do you help them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things I didn't have a chance to go into in this talk, in my student interviews, so I did the interviews in May, and a lot of kids talked about really specific experiences from early in the year. Like I had a kid who talked about the lab we did the first day of school. I had a kid talk about a problem that we had worked on in October. And they were still in May going back to those things as evidence to be able to say that, yes, I'm good at physics. Yes, this is something I can do. And so since I did the interviews in the spring of 2019, I went into this fall like really conscious of what did I want to do that first week and how did I want to frame those activities to make sure that students were seeing success right away. And so I give the FCI at the start of the school year as well. I waited until the end of that first week to do it so that students could get hands-on, they could use materials, they could be successful at figuring out some concepts from a lab before they were asked to do this test that, to be frank, I expect them to do really poorly on in the fall because they haven't learned physics yet. I also was really conscious about setting up the FCI as, you know, this is something that even a lot of students who've completed a first-year college course don't get very high scores on. And this is stuff that you haven't learned about yet. So I'm not worried about your scores. I want to see, what do you know so far? What ideas do you have so that we can build on those ideas and help you to improve this year? And I think that framing helped kids keep from freaking out when they took the FCI. And yeah, there were some really tough questions. The kids definitely thought the questions were really tough, but I think that helped keep them from being as freaked out by it.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question, which is Eileen Kirschbaum.
Hi, yes, excellent presentation. I was just wondering, like, if at the beginning of the year, I find with the girls, which I have very few, they tend to, in lab groups, always start taking the role of data collector, you know, making the charts. They're always the ones that go right away and like, okay, I'm the one making the chart. And then, you know, the boys are the ones building things. Is there some way to like institute like something with the groups at the beginning where you kind of get them to take on different roles than the ones they're really most confident or comfortable with?
Yeah, that is a super common phenomenon. I see it in my classroom. I think Frank Noscasi mentioned the paper titled Hermione and the Secretary in the chat. I know Natasha, I just read a paper by Natasha Holmes that sees a similar phenomenon. So my approach, I've been using group roles a lot more. And I randomly assign them. I literally have cards with the role printed with the roles on them. Students randomly draw one and they have the card right in front of them so they can remember what their role is, what they should be doing, what kinds of things they should be saying. That seems to help. As I start to get comfortable with my students, I talk to them a little bit about some of those patterns. I address it as, it's not necessarily that you're being sexist, it's that this is a pattern that's really been drilled into all of us. And so try to think about when you're working with your group, how you can break out of that pattern.
Great, thank you so much. I think we'll take a couple minutes to introduce and transition to the next speaker, who is Jolene Johnson, who's going to talk about strategies to support English language learners in high school physics.
All right, welcome to our talk. Today we're going to talk about strategies to support English language learner students in high school physics. My name is Dr. Jolene Johnson.
I'm Billy Menz.
And we teach at Edison High School in Minneapolis. Our talk really has two objectives. First, we're going to describe some lessons that we developed that helps us build a more inclusive classroom and encourages students to develop a more positive STEM identity.
We'll also provide some examples of some EL supports that can build discourse and oral language development in science for not only your EL students, but all your students.
So our talk, we're just going to introduce ourselves and our students in our school. We'll give you some ideas of some best practices for EL instruction, and then we will outline those key components of our classroom, including something called My STEM Story, the Careers Unit, the Diversity Unit, and then some physics content curriculum that is based on NGSS and modeling curriculum. We co-teach together. We actually co-teach or co-taught one class together, and then a lot of this was used in my other physics classes. 2 years ago, we co-taught 2 classes together. As I said, I'm Dr. Jolene Johnson. I do have a PhD in physics. I was a college professor until 2 years ago when I started at Edison High School. I'm the president of the Minnesota chapter of the AAPT. I'm a lead Step Up ambassador, and you'll see some of the lessons refer to that. So Step Up is a program that's designed to encourage more women and diverse students to go into physics. And then in the fall, I'm actually moving to Spring Lake Park High School.
My name is Billy Menz. I'm a master's of English as a second language. So I've been an EL teacher for about 4 years. I've taught in an elementary school. I've taught in basically every K through 12 setting, even charter schools in Texas, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, and now Minnesota. I've been with Minneapolis Public Schools since 2009, and I'm currently the department chair at Edison High School.
So our school and students, so it's Edison High School. Our school is a very urban high school, so we have 85% free and reduced lunch. It's 85% non-white. There's a lot of homeless and highly mobile students. Our enrollment is from Northeast Minneapolis, although we also draw from North Minneapolis. The physics classes in particular are 42% EL and 16% SPED students. The class we co-taught together was actually 100% either EL or SPED. And then a lot of these strategies that we're going to talk about, I also used in my IB Year 2 class, which had a large number of minorities and some EL students in that class as well.
Hi. So in our school, we do what I like to call empathetic grading, but it's also based on the IB diploma program. So 4 is proficient. So we're trying to get those students to that 4 level to have proficiency in the content. It makes it very challenging to get to a 6 through an 8, which is a A level, but it also makes it more approachable and ideal for EL students to achieve a 2 or a 3 on things as they're reaching that proficiency level. We also offer retakes for tests. So when that's part of the process of learning. So when a student takes a test and they might not get the score that they want, if they haven't met proficiency, they can have up to 2 different retakes on those tests. And that's a lot of times where my EL support comes in for my students who did not meet proficiency on the first exam.
And then we also emphasize in the class, we have a homework policy. There's 15 minutes of homework every day. It's graded on effort. We don't accept late homework because we want students working every day, but there is a certain number of scores dropped. So students have an opportunity, if they're busy, they can drop a few days of homework.
So I want everybody to know that you are a language teacher. Even though you teach in physics or you teach in the sciences, you are a language teacher. And the Common Core strategy, the Common Core standards and the NGSS standards really speak to a lot of language development. This graphic shows how they're all kind of related. And when we're getting ELs to do things with language, then we're actually supporting all of our students. The principles of math instruction for EL, physics is a lot of math, right? And people have told us to try and take the math out of physics, and I don't know how to do that. So as a language teacher, I'm trying to use the best practices for the math instruction for ELs. And the Understanding Language group, which is out of Stanford University, has come up with some principles that really help guide us, that we're focusing on reasoning and not the accuracy, that there is complex language involved in science instruction and math instruction that we have to help build students up to. And the principle number 4 is really important and sometimes gets glossed over, is we really need to recognize and treat that every day like their home language and also their home experiences for ELs as assets for the classroom, not deficiencies.
All right, so here's the part where we'll talk about a couple of the units we developed. So the first thing we do in the first 2 weeks of classes is we do something called My STEM Story. Basically, this is a chance for students to tell us about their experiences in STEM, be them good or bad. It's a 2-day experience, so the students on day 1 kind of write down some ideas and share ideas with other students. They're really trying to answer some of these questions you see on your screen right now. So for instance, what is your experience with STEM? Do you want to become a scientist? Why or why not? And this gets at their STEM identities. And usually what we find is that a lot of students in our high school do not have good STEM identities, and they really don't feel like they belong in physics or STEM for one reason or another.
This is an example of where we can bring in that community or the family structure. So kids will think about only their science experiences at school. They think of them very limited, when we want to try and push them to see where their science experiences or math experiences are outside of the classroom. So that's where I come in and try and help support them with that.
Yeah, and this graphic organizer really helps them see where STEM might show up and gives them a chance to write some ideas down. So the next unit that we're going to talk about is the Careers in Physics unit. This is part of the Step Up curriculum, which I put the link at the top. This is an APS, AAPT, NSF-funded program that encourages women and minorities to go into physics. The overall goal of this unit is to allow students to learn about a wide variety of physics-related careers, and then allow them to see themselves as physicists. For many of them, that's the first time that they've ever thought about even being in STEM at all. The unit takes about 4 days, typically in early October. You can see a lot of lesson components there. The things that are highlighted are some of the things that are EL friendly or that we've noted or that we've put in to help the EL students. The key components is we have the students explore different careers. They put up some Post-it notes about what they think physicists do at the start of the lesson and then at the end of the lesson, so we can see their growth there. And then we have them write their own career profile that explores them being physicists. So here's an example of what it looks like before on the top. So you can see at the start of the lesson, pretty much they think that physicists become physics teachers or maybe engineers and do research. By the end of the lesson, they have a much wider variety of career options. Especially interesting as they see a lot more physicists in medicine and health and business, both of which are areas that our students are very interested in. And so then they can see that physics might help them with that. And then here's some examples of that career profile that we have the students write. So again, it could be any career that they can tie to physics. One student here wrote about pediatric oncology physician assistant. Another student wrote about structural engineering. We also have students write about such wide variety of things such as nature photographer. So there's a huge variety of things that students choose to write about. And then the next unit is the diversity in physics unit. Again, this is part of the Step Up unit, and then I've expanded it to add more about racial diversity. So the goal of the unit, we first explore statistics about diversity in physics, so we understand that there is a lack of diversity in physics, and then we develop ideas of why this is and what could be done to address this problem. This unit is about 2 weeks long, so we won't have a chance to go through all the components. You can see some of the key ones here. But we talk about some statistics around underrepresented minorities in physics and women. We read some articles, and then at the end we have them write an essay about diversity using their class experiences and their personal experiences to explore what could be done to address this lack of diversity. So we use graphs and images a lot in our classroom because it's accessible for students and we can gain a lot of thinking. So this graph was particularly interesting because you could make a lot of claims from it and add a lot of color. So students were able to identify and make key observations. One strategy we used, and this is a discourse strategy, so we're going to move to the next slide. But if you can tell, the different lines on that graph really indicate and allow for students to make observations. So a lot of times students will not observe the simple things when that's really where they're going to make those claims. So as a language teacher, and yes, I'm calling you language teachers, you're trying to encourage discourse in your classroom. And something like a we notice, we wonder, we claim strategy helps do that in a whole group instruction. So because we're making the ideas public, you might have a student say something about the graph and you can help clarify it or restate it. We can emphasize ideas. You're teaching kids to listen to each other. So we would exhaust probably 10 observations or we notice statements, and then we would go on to what we're wondering, and then eventually we're getting kids to write or orally share claim statements about this graph. There's other discourse strategies that we use in the classroom. The one that I'd like to talk about is mix and mingle, because it's really quick, but it also has a lot of benefit. So
we want them, I just have them stand up and they mix and they make eye contact and then they mingle for about 30 seconds to a minute about anything I want. Maybe it's about their STEM story, maybe it's about a vocabulary word, and then they stop and I yell out again, mix. They mix around, they go to another person. So that way they're getting 3 to 4 different people that they get to talk to and practice oral language, and it takes about 5 minutes of the class time if you do it right. There's other strategies on here, and if you have questions about those, please ask after the presentation.
We just wanted to share an example of one day of the lesson. So this is one specific day within the diversity unit, and it includes some EL support. So the day was really 3 stations. One's led by Billy, one's led by me. The 3 stations are, we have them read a social science article where we've cut apart the title, abstract, and a key graph, and they have to match those together. And then we do a supported article reading, and then we have a station that I led where they were sharing their anonymous reactions to gender and race and STEM experiences, both things that I have had happen and then things that their fellow classmates wrote in anonymously.
So one of the things that we would do is the matching. So I really liked this activity for getting students to access higher level scientific articles. So instead of having the whole 12 to 15 page article that students had to read, we cut apart and had the title, the abstract, and then either a graph or something else that was in the article, and they were trying to piece those together. And then in the smaller group reading, they might look at one of those articles and go deeper. But this really helps get them to access that reading and then allows them to go into the deeper reading a little bit later.
In the interest of time, we're just going to talk about these in the questions if you have additional questions, but we also did the supported article reading and then a discussion of their experiences. And then the final part of this unit was we had them write an essay, and you can see the prompt here. So they were really being asked, are women and minorities underrepresented in physics? And then encouraging them to use information they learned in class and their own life experiences to talk about why that is, and then what could we do as a class and as a society and as individuals to improve the situation.
So one thing as language teachers, when you write this out ahead of time, you can develop what's called a cloze activity, C-L-O-Z-E, and I don't know if you know what that is, but it's basically a fill in the blank. So a lot of times for ELs, especially lower level ELs, you want to create what's an ideal response and then break it up and pull stuff out that they can then fill in. Students sometimes can just do a clear outline. It allows for them to sort of meet the different levels of proficiency in physics with their current level in EL, which could be level 2s or a lot lower than level 3s, level 4s, but we want to have that accessible to all students.
And then the last unit we'll quick talk about is the physics content that we are trying to address. So we're going to use kinematics as an example. So all of this is based on NGSS along with modeling curriculum. The key components of our kinematics unit where they started off the whole unit using a constant velocity car experiment. So the students designed the experiment, took the data, graphed it, and that graph led them to discover the kinematics equation. And then we also worked a lot on describing motion using different representations, so motion diagrams, graphs, written descriptions, equations, and then we had them solving word problems using a complete problem-solving method. We really focus on that there's different ways to represent the same information, so here's an example of what a test might look like on that. So they need to be able to describe motion using words in sentence form. They need to describe the motion using motion diagrams, including adding velocity and acceleration vectors. They need to be able to draw a position versus time graph and a velocity versus time graph and see that they're all really different ways to represent the same information, and that which way you pick to represent that information just depends on what you're trying to get out of it.
When you're teaching these things, using color coding is a really good instructional practice. You can keep going. I know we're late on time. But breaking things up into different chunks is really helpful for EL students. And sometimes the color coding of that is really helpful. Vocabulary, I use Venn diagrams quite a bit. Using content that is content words that are very closely aligned that students confuse a lot. Use this to sort of help see that there are a lot of similarities. There's a reason why they're confused about velocity and acceleration. what are those specific differences.
And then here's just a test structure. So again, remember this is a proficiency-based scale, and it's actually for each problem. You can see they're all out of 8 points. We give them multiple types of problems. This is an example of a problem where they have to combine all that information. And you can see this is a scaffold that we give them and have them practice on ahead of time. So they know that they're going to have to draw pictures and define variables and make graphs and write a word description and then do the math at the end. Whereas typically a lot of physics classrooms, it's just focused on the math and getting the right answer. Here they have a lot of ways to show the different types of knowledge that they have.
And again, it's chunking that information for ELs, which this organizer was really helpful for students to feel like they could access the physics and the math that they had to do in the class. So what can you do in your classroom? Just a couple of quick things, just, increasing oral language production and increasing the discussion that's happening in your class. Look up Discourse Strategies, Ask Me More. Explicitly teaching vocabulary and structures. So thinking about how those science structures of compare and contrast or claiming are really important. So building that background knowledge, when you build, a lot of times students don't have the experiences with science that our native speakers come with, or really our white kids come with. So we have to build that experience for those students, and then just continually increasing those speaking opportunities and looking for a level of accuracy. So not always just looking for perfectly accurate, but where can I pull out something that they have supported here? So, and wait time.
In conclusion, and you'll have a chance hopefully to write or to ask a few questions. I know this is all really quick, but we gave you some ideas of the units that we've developed that help us understand our students' background, and it increases the ability of marginalized students to identify with STEM. Particularly important for EL students, but honestly, it's really important for basically all the students, especially in our urban high school setting.
So hopefully this will help build a more inclusive classroom, because the EL strategies will help support those EL students, but it will also involve and engage your other native speakers.
So thank you to different funding and other members of our team, and for the conference and funders for the opportunity to speak.
Please ask questions.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I'll open the floor to Veronica, who has her hand up.
Good afternoon. My question, is it possible to get connected with you all so we can, I would love, you talked about some strategies that was something I haven't seen before, and I think I would love to use it in my classroom. Is there a way to to contact you?
I can put my email in the chat, my personal email.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can do the same as well. And I also really want to advocate too, not all of this is part of Step Up, but if you look now, probably a long time ago, there's a link to Step Up. And so there are some preset lessons that you can just download and use. And I'm working on, actually this summer, I'm a Step Up lead. So a lot of the stuff on diversity, that will be its own lesson that I'm working on putting together, and that will be posted as well. But some of the strategies and stuff you can just email me, and I'm happy to share anything.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a quick question, which is I'm wondering how if you're able to talk to your students around sort of inequities within their own school and communities. I know that STEM is a big sort of macro topic, but I'm curious what kinds of conversations or dialogue happen with your students around, inequities within the high school or the school district or the state.
I'll start. You care if I start, Billy?
Go ahead.
So yes, of course it came up. So like I said, our high school draws from North Minneapolis, and North Minneapolis is majority. It's basically where all the minorities live. Most of the minorities live in Minneapolis. And one of the other things that I do to connect to this unit that we didn't really talk about is there's this documentary called Jim Crow of the North, which is about basically how racist Minneapolis housing policies and the history of racism in Minneapolis has influenced our current situation, which is why we have such unequal access even within the same district. And I have the students actually look at the course catalog for the other high schools and see that there's a huge difference, again, within the same district, and kind of connect, their lived experiences with how they're treated to what's going on at the city level and what's going on at the school district level. Because my goal is that they're empowered to see what's going on so that they realize, you know, maybe the reason they don't really identify as physicists might be because of all these other things that are happening around them and not really their fault.
Well, and for me as an EL teacher, in our school we have IB, we don't have AP, we have IB. And some kids take IB and some kids don't. And it's a big inequity that comes up for students. As an EL teacher, I feel like most of my job is advocating for my students and making sure they have access to those higher level classes. So physics is a higher level class by itself, but also those inequities come up in conversation quite a bit. And students, we have to be receptive to those.
Thank you. The next person is Greg Morrison.
Hi, thanks so much for such a great talk, and it seems like really great work. I was wondering, do you feel that you've been successful sort of disseminating this idea to minority, historically underrepresented or underserved schools? And what strategies did you find were successful in sort of building bridges to these communities?
I can speak to that really quick. I felt like one of the biggest strategies that really helped was Dr. Johnson sharing her story as a female in physics. That was really powerful for a lot of the students. And as far as disseminating it to other schools, no, we have not yet. I will be working on that and the work that Dr. Johnson and I have done and advocating to make sure that ELs are offered physics. Sometimes they're not even offered physics in classrooms, and that's sort of a slip on most of education's fault. But what we're trying to do is, I think that the most successful thing is when we can present and show them and change their identity, kind of like what Marta was talking about. Kids come into the classroom, especially EL kids, with an identity that they're not physicists, that they don't have any connection to physics. And when they see that they can, through some of the lessons that Dr. Johnson presented, it really turns the tide for them. And by the end of the year, they believe they can do it. Of course, sometimes that's a little bit too late. We're trying to make it so that it's a little earlier.
One other thing too to add, like I said, I will be putting these lessons up on the Step Up. So I'm working on the extension that's all about the race part of the diversity unit. So that will all be available hopefully by the end of summer. And you can also sign up. There's Step Up ambassadors who can come do training. So if your district wants training, there's 50 ambassadors around the country who will come do it. That's part of what we're paid to do. So I'd recommend you look it up. And then as far as disseminating this to other schools, I would say it's been very difficult. So even within the same school district, I was leading the physics curriculum development for NGSS. We're getting new standards. And honestly, I couldn't convince more than 1 or 2 other teachers in the district to even try this. And I couldn't convince the other physicists in my school to do this. And a lot of people, right, assume this is not a big issue and why would you waste, like I spent like 3 weeks on this, but I feel like if the kids don't identify with the class, it's never going to go well. And so I'm open to other ideas of how to convince people that this is really important and everyone should be doing it.
Thank you. Next question up is for Brian Callow.
Thank you guys very much. It was great. I work in a small school in southern New Jersey, and we actually have a pretty similar population. I'd say about 1/3 of our students are Ls. And I always have a difficult time recruiting, getting them into the physics classroom to begin with. I was wondering if you could say a few words about recruitment.
I think that
Go ahead.
one of the things to recruit those kids in is to provide support for them. And so the fact that I'm supporting physics gives them another level to where they feel like they can be successful in those classes. I don't know what your capability is. If you have 1/3 ELs, you probably have quite a few EL teachers, or at least 1 or 2, and using those EL teachers to make sure that you're pushing them into those classes. In Minnesota, they can take physics or chemistry. We don't have the capacity to really support both of those classes. So for me as an EL department chair, I'm going to be pushing a lot more of my physics, my EL kids, to take physics over chemistry. But it's a choice for them. They can choose, but the support is going to be in physics. You have to make those choices. So making that distinction that, hey, physics is where we want to throw support, that might improve your recruitment.
Also making sure you're careful about the messages the other people in your school might be sending. I know I've had a lot of problems with our counselors sometimes not necessarily sending people to the right classes and having ideas of what physics and engineering is. I mean, it goes all the way up through administration too. So that's one thing. And then also just talking earlier, like ninth grade, I developed a partnership with the physical science teacher so that they had a similar version of these lessons, like an intro version of these lessons. So the students start thinking in ninth grade about careers, and that helps them think about, should I be taking physics?
Thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. I'll get to Holly in 1 minute. One final point from one observation from both sessions is this was entitled Equity in the Physics Classroom. And a lot of what I heard is also about identity in the physics classroom. So how students' identity as an English language learner, as someone who's not American, as someone who is a woman, as someone who is a minority, how those identities are really the backbone of the student's ability to learn and absorb and be motivated to achieve, and to really take seriously the students' identities in terms of language and culture, and that's a really integral part of our jobs too. So that's my summation of the sessions, and I learned a lot. Thank you. I will leave it to Holly to ask the last question.
Well, we might not have time, and this feels a little off topic, but I was wondering if you have time, could you talk briefly about your about your methods for discourse encouragement?
Oh, if we can go back to that slide, maybe I could get. So they're just quick ways for kids to kind of to encourage discourse in your classroom. So putting your 2 cents in, you have them in a small group, they each get 2 pennies. And then once you've put your 2 cents in, other people at the table have to talk. Okay, so something simple like that. What do you think is encouraging your students that when they are in a small group, or even if they're in a large group, after they're done speaking, to say, what do you think, Jolene? Instead of just like expecting somebody else to fill that space. A lot of times, especially EL kids or kids who are quiet, need that invitation to speak. The triangle talk is something that's just has 3 different corners where you just flip it around. Like there might be a reader, there might be a summarizer. Sort of a lot of these things come from elementary school background, but they work at the high school level. And to sum up what the previous speaker said, it's been really fascinating to be an EL teacher in a physics classroom, which is mostly a 12th grade class, and also have taught kindergarten and 1st grade and 2nd grade over the years. Because a lot of the things that what you guys are fighting against is a long-term identity crisis for students. That they have never been told that they're learning physics. They've never been told that they're learning algebra, even when they're in 1st grade. So they already have these fears associated, especially, young people of color, young kids who come in a little bit behind when they're in kindergarten. So you all are battling something that is 11 years in the making before you even see these kids. And to break those things down, that's why Dr. Johnson and her lessons about equity and like really trying to examine this helps those kids identify those. There can be backlash. Like people can think, oh, that's racist. And then like you have to be able to sort of manage that discussion because you might be the target. So it's really important for you all to kind of realize that you're battling a long-term thing that's real, that happens throughout their educational process. But we have to be strong and educate and advocate for those students of color and those EL students who really deserve to take physics. They deserve it.
Thank you. I think that wraps up the session.